Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. Hizbullah will triumph over Takfiri terrorist groups. This is a message given by the Secretary General of the Lebanese resistance group Hizbullah. Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah has accused Takfiri groups of being behind the deadly bombing in Beirut on Thursday that killed 27 people. He says the groups are supported by Israel, subjecting the whole region to terrorism. Nasrallah also said that Hezbollah and its supporters are firmer than ever in their commitment to stop the terrorists.
One day after a massive explosion which rocked the Beirut southern suburbs, hundreds of thousands of Hezbollah supporters flocked to the southern village of Ait Shab to celebrate the 7th anniversary of the end of the 2006 war. Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah uncovered during his televised speech on the occasion that Israeli-backed Takfiri groups are behind the bombing which occurred in the southern suburbs last July, and several other attacks against the army and the Shiite population in the Bekaa area.
We will respond to any new explosion by doubling the number of our fighters against Takfiris in Syria. Just as we won in all our wars against Israel, we will win the battle against terrorism and Takfiris.
The latest bombing has left some 24 people dead and over 100 injured. Observers believe that such acts are being facilitated by internal sides, which are tools for the West and Israel.
Israel was defeated by the resistance, and this has led it to use its tools inside Lebanon to continue its aggressions. The last bombings were a response to the many defeats Israel has seen by the resistance.
Sayyed Nasrallah noted that the Takfiri threat is against all of Lebanon, not only a certain sect. The leader of the resistance also warned Israel that it would be defeated by the resistance if it tried to enter Lebanese land again.
Through the Labuna incident, we aim to stress that it is no more allowed for any Israeli soldier to cross into Lebanon and desecrate Lebanese lands.
Activists from all over the Arab world attended the ceremony and stressed that the victory of 2006 was a victory for all Arabs and Muslims.
The victory of 2006 has proven that resistance is the only solution and the only way to retrieve the stolen rights and occupied lands.
The village of Ait Shab was the stage of fierce fighting during the 2006 summer war, which Hezbollah and its supporters believe ended with a divine victory for the resistance on August 14, 2006.
Hezbollah's strongest weapon has always been its massive popular support, which was evident especially after the 2006 summer war. Despite the destructive Israeli aggression, the continuous terrorist threats have also failed to discourage these people from supporting Hezbollah's resistance, especially in any war against Israel. Mariam Saleh, Press TV from Ait Shab, South Lebanon.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, broadcaster and political commentator out of San Antonio, Texas, Mr. Mark Dankoff, and a political commentator out of Beirut, Lebanon, Mr. Jihad Morakadeh. Thank you so much for both of you being with us. Let me start it off in Beirut. Now, Mr. Morakadeh said Hassan Nasrallah has said that Israel is behind the Takfiri groups. Your take on his comment?
I do not think that Israel is behind the Takfiri group, because if this was the case, Sayyed Hassan said yesterday that it was not Israel behind them, so I don't know who to believe. The Takfiri group have been going around for quite some time. They've been fighting in Iraq, and it was Syria who was behind them at the time. They've been fighting a little bit all over. When they fought in Lebanon against the Lebanese army in 2008 in Nahr al-Barid, it was Syria who was behind them. And it was Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah who was defending them, asking the army not to go and get them out of Nahr al-Barid. So I doubt if it's Israel who is behind them.
Okay, what about Mr. Dankoff, of what the Secretary General of the resistant group Hezbollah has said, that it is Israel behind the Takfiri groups? Your take, sir.
My take is this, that the people behind this are the same people who are behind the Sabra and Shatila refugee massacres in Lebanon in 1982. The same people that, according to ex-Mossad agent Victor Ostrovsky, were really behind the bombing of the United States Marine Corps barracks in Beirut in 1983. And last but not least, according to many credible sources, were also behind, really behind, the assassination of Rafiq Hariri in Lebanon, the former prime minister. The fact of the matter is that these Takfiris are clearly being utilized by Israel and by Zionist interests, and it's the same coalition behind this in Lebanon that has been up to no good in Syria.
Well, what about that, Mr. Morkadi? The same entities that have that are behind the situation in Lebanon that has caused all the problems in Syria.
I really cannot take what the gentleman said. I cannot take it really seriously. Linking Sabra and Shatila, when there was no such thing as Takfiri at the time, with the marine bombing, with the assassination of Hariri, I cannot believe all of that. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, the assassination of Hariri has to do with those who support the Syrian regime, because Hariri has been against the Syrian regime. This is my take on it. He can think differently. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, I really think that the Syrian regime is the one who has been feeding the Takfiris all along, sending them to Iraq to fight the Americans and even the Shia in Iraq, because the Sunni Takfiris have been fighting the Shia in Iraq, being sent by Syria itself. And it is Prime Minister Maliki himself who accused the Syrian president of sending Takfiris to his country. Now, all of a sudden, it is Israel. Yes, I mean, Israel is a very easy target. As I say, you know, whenever you wanted something, you say it's Israel.
Okay, well, let's look at that, Mr. Dankoff. Why do you say that Israel is behind the situation as far as the Takfiri groups?
Well, who benefits by all of this? I mean, clearly it's demonstrable that in Syria, the people that are behind the arming of these foreign mercenaries, many of whom are linked to Wahhabic extremists and al-Qaeda, are the Saudi Arabians, the Gulf cooperation states, and Syria, in what is provably a very nefarious alliance both with the Zionist state of Israel and the United States. The fact of the matter is that all of this is a prelude to an attack on Iran that Benjamin Netanyahu is thirsting for, and the fact of the matter is that there are certain interests in the Middle East that oppose Zionism and that oppose what the Zionists want to do in Iran and that oppose what the Zionists are doing in Palestine, who have to be done away with according to the Israeli game plan. That means getting rid, ultimately, of a Shiite regime in Iraq that, ironically enough, was installed by the United States when they intervened against Saddam Hussein in 2003. It also involves getting rid of an Alawite Shiite regime in Syria that is aligned with Iran. And clearly it involves trying to destroy Hizbullah in Lebanon at the behest of those who ultimately want a war with Iran and want to continue a wider war with the Palestinians. We simply have to ask who benefits by all of this, and the fact of the matter is that I think it's very clear that Israel benefits by it.
Okay, well, Mr. Morkadi, who do you think benefits from all the chaos that we're seeing in the region? We have Syria basically on fire. We have Egypt now with the people basically now going against each other. And, of course, we have the regular areas of Afghanistan and now Iraq. And the region in general is extremely chaotic and unstable right now. Who do you think benefits the most from this?
I think the people of the region are those who benefit the most, and certainly not Israel. Because the day when people started going out in the streets in Syria, they were going out in masses, unarmed, for about 6 months. And during all this time, it was the Syrian regime who was shooting on those people who were unarmed during the first 6 months. So are you trying to tell me that the Syrian regime is an ally of Israel shooting at these demonstrators? I do not think so.
Okay.
I think it is a purely local play in every single situation. In Afghanistan, what do the Mujahideen in Afghanistan have to do with Israel? What does America in Afghanistan, who is fighting the Taliban and fighting the Bin Laden people, has to do with Israel? Is it Israel who sent the planes on 9/11? and then they ask the Americans to go and fight them in Afghanistan.
Yes.
I mean, you know, you can pull that thing. Yes, you can pull that thing a long, long way. And I can say also that the Iranian regime, for example, is an agent of Israel, and that Bashar al-Assad is an agent of Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu is an agent of Iran. Yes, you can pull it as long as you want.
Okay, well, let me get Mark Dankoff back in. Mark, you seem to want to comment. Go ahead, sir.
Well, let me take 9/11, for example. I will simply quote Dr. Alan Sabrowski, the Jewish professor, by the way, at the National United States Army War College, who says that 9/11, in fact, was an Israeli Mossad operation from start to finish. We don't have time to cover that in detail here, but I would simply point people to my interview with Courage Ziabari of Fars News on this. I would point people to Christopher Bolin's work on 9/11 and Dr. Robertson Genes's review of Mr. Bolin's book for E. Michael Jones' Culture Wars, so that people can look at all of these sources and see what the evidence actually is. The fact of the matter is, it's very, very clear that when we look at what is happening in Syria, that there is a confluence and a congruence of interest between the Sunni Islamic monarchical states led by Saudi Arabia, the so-called Gulf Cooperation Council states, and the Zionist state of Israel. They both have their reasons for wanting to get rid of President Assad in Syria. They both have their reasons for wanting to intervene in Lebanon. And it's quite clear that this is pretty much the same type of thing that has been used over time to develop the same scenario that we saw with Libya, which is ultimately an American NATO intervention, potentially both in Lebanon and in Syria, as a prelude towards setting up a final attack and assault on the regime in Iran. I think this is clearly what's going on, and if we really want to get into the players in 9/11, I think we need to go back and look at some of these sources that I cited.
Okay, well, maybe on another program with the 9/11 situation. But Mr. Morikani, looking at in general, you said that it is the people of the region that benefits. We're looking at car bombs going off in Iraq, in Lebanon. We're looking at many people being slaughtered in the region. Tell me, how do you think that this is beneficial to the people of the region?
Okay. You have, first of all, to look at the region before that. Before the Arab Spring, you had a region which was dominated by dictators and police states in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and so on. And then the Americans got rid of Saddam Hussein. You have a situation now in Iraq which is not ideal because people are still fighting each other, but you have had some kind of elections and some kind of a system going on. In Syria also, first let's get back to Tunisia. In Tunisia, you had a situation which was not ideal because of the Muslim Brotherhood, but then again, this is democracy. People were elected. In Egypt, unfortunately, the Muslim Brotherhood went a little bit too far, but the people were happy to get rid of Mubarak. That's why I said the people. In Syria, it has not finished yet. But all of these things happen, you know, it is a war because a regime which is crumbling down is going to fight until the end. The Syrian regime is fighting with everything they can. They are killing their people right, left, and center, destroying their cities, their bridges, and you're telling me it's Israel? It's Israel who is pushing the Syrian regime to bomb from the air with aircrafts, to bomb the bridges, the hospitals, the schools, the cities? Okay, what has Israel got to do with this? Or is that the Takfiris who are bombing from the air?
Mark Dankoff, looking at the situation in the region, as we know, the bomb that went off a couple of days ago in Beirut. And as I said, looking at Iraq, that on a daily basis, we're seeing people being killed. And of course, we know the situation in Syria, that the country has been under so much pressure now, more than 2.5 years, and have witnessed absolutely horrific crimes at the hands of the Takfiris. Tell me, when we look at this whole situation, because you said that you believe that Tel Aviv is behind this, do you think the goal is basically to have the people inside this region destroy themselves, or is it to keep the people busy as Israel for example, carries out more settlements or do other things. So what do you think the ultimate goal of the Israelis, if they are involved, would be?
I think it's both. I think clearly when we look at the statistics that Pat Buchanan has cited on this situation, the demographic statistics in Palestine, that Israel knows that they have to do something rather drastic in order to survive as a state. It's clear that that's going to have to involve a level of genocide that we have not seen yet up to this point. It's clear that when you look at the statements of these Zionist leaders since the end of the 19th century, that their ultimate goal is to extend the borders of Israel from the Nile River to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, all the way to north of the Litani River in Lebanon. This is obviously what's going on here. When we ask who benefits by all of this strife and war and killing and terrorism in the region, the chief beneficiaries are going to prove to be Israel, the international bankers who always make monies off of war, and finally the international multinational energy consortiums who will profit by the destruction of these indigenous countries when they can then move in and install people who will do whatever it is that they want. So I think there's pretty much a threefold demonic trinity at work in here in this situation. And we're going to see it unfold, I think, in the next couple of years in what is likely to be both a regional war in the Middle East and potentially a global conflict that could even see the overt intervention of the so-called superpowers, the United States on the one hand, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and potentially the Chinese on the other may be involved in their own counter moves. This is an extremely dangerous situation.
Okay, well, let's take a quick break and look at some of our Facebook viewers have sent in some of their comments. Let's check them out.
Between those groups such as Takfiri, Al-Qaeda, Taliban and other terrorist groups are strong relations and links. It seems their activities occurred in the Persian Gulf countries. Where were these so-called Takfiri guys when Hizbullah was fighting for the liberation and emancipation for the Arab Muslim land from the Israeli occupation? Now they jump from nowhere to prove how ungrateful and foolish they are. If not stupidity, what will make man attack his own very country in the face of his real enemy?
Well, let me get Mr. Morikati back in on this. Your perspective, Mr. Morikati, on Facebook viewers' comments.
Is there anything specific? Because there were quite a few comments and
well,
so
looking
for
at,
example, the Takfiri.
Let's take a look at the last one. It says, where were these Takfiris, or these so-called Takfiris, when Hezbollah was fighting for the liberation and emancipation of Arab Muslim lands?
Well, they were fighting also against the Americans in Afghanistan. They were fighting against the Shia regime in Iraq, financed and supported by Syria at the time. They were also liberating what they consider to be what needs to be liberated. And
but not liberating, not helping to liberate Palestine, which Palestine has been one of the most critical issues facing the Muslims.
Excuse me. No. You have it all wrong here, because what you not realize is that during all the time in Lebanon when Hezbollah was fighting for the liberation of Lebanon, nobody else was allowed to fight down there. Not the Takfiris, nor anybody else. It was Hezbollah, and strictly Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime who were supporting them. So there was no Takfiris. Even if they wanted to, they were not allowed to go in there. However, where was Syria to liberate the Golan Heights? The Syrian regime, nowhere to be seen. Liberating the Golan Heights is of no interest. But liberating South Lebanon, yes, maybe. So no, I think the Takfiris, who were being armed and financed by Syria, were being sent to wreak havoc in Lebanon, and that's why the Lebanese army attacked them in 2008 in Nahr al-Barid, in the camp of Nahr al-Barid, and afterwards those who were able to flee went to Syria under the cover of the Syrian regime. This is where were the Takfiris, trying to destabilize Lebanon in 2008.
All right, Mr. Dankoff, your take, it's interesting, Mr. our other guest, Mr. Morakade, when talking about the Takfiri groups, seem never to be able to explain why Israel has never been one of the venues that they wanted to attack or try to change. Final comment from you, Mr. Dankoff.
My final comment is this. Why would President Assad want to be doing something in the support of these Takfiris and their acts of terrorism in Lebanon that would provide a justification for an Israeli, NATO, and American intervention in Lebanon and in the region generally?
I will tell you why.
That works at cross purposes with President Assad's own interest, and I think to
Not
believe that Assad is the one who is behind these latest acts of terrorism in Lebanon is simply ridiculous.
And on that note, I'd like to thank both our guests. I'm so sorry we're out of time. I appreciate both of you for being with us. Broadcaster and political commentator, Mr. Mark Dankoff, out of San Antonio, Texas, and political commentator out of Beirut, Lebanon, Mr. Jihad Morakade. And thank you, viewers, for being with us. And make sure you join us right here, same time, same place, for another debate tomorrow. I'm Marzieh Hashimi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Thank you, and goodbye.